You probably already own the cybersecurity tools that you need. That's not the issue. The issue is that nobody's using them, or certainly not using them correctly. Today's guest built an entire cybersecurity culture out of that one realization, 1 week at a time. This is the final episode in our Encore series, where we picked the episodes over the last few years that our listeners really engaged with. We found this guest schooling people on Reddit with a series of posts on what he called a security cadence. His pitch was to skip the new six-figure product and instead commit to one small, deliberate security change and improvement per week. We get into how that habit turned into a real culture shift at his company. Plus, of course, we talk about things like MFA, SIM hijacking, and why he thinks that chasing the latest 0-day misses the point. He goes by his Reddit username of Snorkel42, and he clearly knows his stuff. If this is your first time watching or listening to me, hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. I've been obsessing about backup, recovery, and now cyber recovery for over 30 years. If that's your bag, then I'm your guy. You're not going to find anyone that cares about that topic more than me. Ever since 1993, when I had to tell my boss that there were no backups of the database that we had just lost. Now I've written 5 O'Reilly books, a blog, and a podcast. Here we turn unappreciated admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Hi, folks. Dr. Mike Saylor and I have just published our new book, Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery. Most books on this subject tell you how not to get ransomware. We actually took a different approach. We start by acknowledging the odds of your organization getting hit by some kind of ransomware are virtually 100%. So instead of pretending that we can prevent all of it, we teach you how to prepare for it, respond, and recover. Ransomware is inevitable. Recovery is a choice. Check it out at stopransomware.com. Hi, and welcome to Backup Central Podcast. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. And I have with me my GE deployment consultant, Prasanna Malianti.
Curtis, how's your GE going?
You know, you may recall that a month or so ago, I got GE for the first time. And, you know, for those that don't know what GE is, it's clarified butter. Specifically, it's apparently an Indian thing, right? Because we did learn that GE is from Sanskrit that means sprinkled, which is interesting. But and the thing about it is that it can sit on the counter, like it's shelf
Forever.
stable, so it can sit on the counter. And you made a comment. By the way, I know this because I'm literally editing this episode right now. And you made a comment that, you know, it can sit there probably for a couple of months or until you run out. So I'll just say this: the jar. I thought that I was going to be the only weirdo using the ghee.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I am not the only weirdo using the ghee. In fact, if anything, the rest of the house has used the ghee much more than I have. And that jar that we bought is close to gone.
Yeah.
So I would say
it's convenient. It's super easy. You just keep it out. You warm it up a little. It becomes really liquidy, right? You put it on warm bread. You toast that. Super good. You could also put it in rice, warm rice. It's really good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's butter, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, all the places you can put butter, you can put ghee. It's just, it is interesting for those that have never had it. It has a slightly different flavor than butter, but it is, you know, so there is a, I didn't know what my mouth was going, what was going to happen when I put it in there.
See, that's funny because I never think about that. Like, to me, like butter and
You're
ghee, it's
used
like,
to it.
yeah.
Yeah. The first time I had ghee, I remember going, this tastes different, you know? But it was yummy, you know? So we continue to, but yeah, I think that jar is almost gone. So we're going to have to find the ghee at Costco, which is going to be
they
like
actually, I think they sell like 1 pound. Yeah. 1 pound jars or something.
Well, we have a back by popular demand guest here. He was on the podcast before and is the author of the Security Cadence series on Reddit. Been in IT for about 25 years and in InfoSec about 20 years. and he is, quite the celebrity over there on Reddit
Mm.
because his posts have been incredibly popular with he's got what do they call it over there? The karma of 35,000, which, if you don't know anything about Reddit, that's a
Yeah.
BFD. I'll just say that right now. And we had him previously on the podcast. So if you haven't heard that podcast, you should totally listen to that. Welcome back to the podcast, Snorkel 42.
Good to be back. And I tell you, so last time I learned what karma meant on Reddit. This time I learned what E is. So good for
It's
me.
clarified. So I want to hear about this thing that you mentioned about security cadence. What started, because that was the what do you call that, the thing before the thing, the precursor, the
Genesis.
preamble, in the title,
Yeah. Right.
to the post that we saw that. So where did that term come from?
So the term came from a previous employer I worked at where I was a network engineer. And it was a large company that did not have an InfoSec presence. There was no InfoSec team. It was just kind of considered, hey, all engineers are responsible for security. Um, and we'd have our occasional shots off the bow in terms of security, problems or issues. I hesitate to say breaches, but incidents. And they would occur, and we would all pile into a conference room, and we would talk about what happened and what we should have done to prevent it. And it would always come down to, well, if we just bought six-figure dollar product X, this would not have occurred. Meanwhile, in the data center, there were piles of six-figure products that were completely ignored because those products never run themselves. And if you're complaining of not having resources to run those products, what makes you think you're going to have resources to buy and run new products? So I finally got fed up one day and just challenged the team to, you know what? We got plenty of tooling. That's not the issue. We just don't have, the oomph. We don't have the motivation to actually use it. So why don't we set ourselves a goal for 6 months? We're going to implement a security change every week. Could be a big change, could be a really minor change, but there's going to be something that we just move the ball forward. And also during that 6 months, we are going to just put the kibosh on talking to any vendors. So no products are allowed, no solutions are allowed that we don't already own. And it took some talking and wrangling people, but eventually folks fell in line, and we sat down. We wrote out a list of here's some things just off the top of our head that we know we could implement with very little roadblocks, no impact, and we just started. And we called it our security cadence. Once a week, we have a security cadence of releasing a security update. And it ended around 6 months in. Our CIO came to us and said, "Listen, what you guys are doing is fantastic, but please don't restrict yourself to only free solutions. Like we have money. If there's stuff you need to keep this ball moving, please ask." So it kind of turned the whole thing on its head of securing the company, but also we were no longer begging for resources. The executive leadership was begging us to start spending resources because they saw what we were doing and saw the value.
So, could you talk a little bit? I'm sure at the very beginning, as you're starting this, right, with any new process or any new endeavor, it's a little difficult, right? Sort of getting into what does it mean and trying to figure things out. So, what were some of the challenges you guys went through, and how did you address that?
Yeah, so I would say the biggest challenge with any sort of security change, especially in a large company, is just the unknown of what will this break? Because quite often, especially in those early days, what you're changing are out of the box configurations. So there's this kind of mentality of, well, it's probably an out of box configuration for some reason, or we don't know what legacy. I mean, this company that I was working at the time was started in the 1930s. We don't know what kind of legacy applications are relying on this technology. So I would say the biggest thing was to just start easy. Take the really easy ones and get as much buy-in as you can. Sit down with the engineers and can anyone think of anything that would break by doing this? And you'll get some feedback of, yeah, but who cares? It's not going to fix anything. Like, okay, that's fine. Let's just do it anyways. And then start, slowly ramping it up and taking little bite-sized chunks. And if you look at the security cadence Reddit post, that's exactly how I've been approaching them. I've started off with just really easy things to do and things that I would not expect to break many enterprises. I try to make it very clear in those posts of, everyone's environment is different and be careful. But, I've called out certain items of this isn't going to break anything. Just do it. Please
Yeah,
just do it.
I do remember in your the trio of posts that you did that were around ransomware. You had there was a phrase that came up a lot. It's escaping me at the moment, but it was like, turn this on and then customize as necessary, right? That that you can't, that no one solution does. You can make a general rule, for example, and then you're going to find somebody that needs that thing turned on, the thing you just turned off.
Sure.
You're going to find somebody that needs that turned on, and then you can turn it on for them, right? And that's okay.
Yeah. So one of the catchphrases, or one of my guiding lights in InfoSec, is to never let perfect get in the way of being good. And I call it
Yep.
out a lot. And part of the reason why I lean on it so heavily is it's often a voice of dissension that you get from folks when you're trying to talk them into things, like, oh, well, that won't solve this one edge case, so let's not do it at all. And when it comes to security is all about layers, and it's all about catching the attacker. And yeah, this may not solve all of your problems, but it might be the alert that gets generated that tells you that they're there. So it is definitely a strong demand I make of people of, if you can only do this for one system, great, it's better than none. And yeah, so there's something to be said about going slow and implementing slowly, but there's also something to be said about implementing broad and then backing off where you need to.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that when you try the latter, when I was thinking about your initial this 6 months program that you had, the farther you got into that 6 months and the more complicated things that you were doing that were potentially riskier, if you will, to the environment, that you could potentially impact someone's ability to do their job, the more you're going to need support from above, right? Like I told them to do this. We're sorry that it broke. We'll we turned it off for now. We didn't realize that by pushing this one button was going to make everyone in the company not be able to log in ever. We've turned it off until we figure that out, right? Don't go beat Snorkel up.
Yeah. And maybe that's also where you get some of those early wins before you take on those. So you get sort of the buy-in from upper management that, hey, they are doing the right things. They are making improvements. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest allies of InfoSec people that they forget about is the CFO. The CFO is the person, when you're doing these sorts of things, that you want to have in your back pocket to be able to go have that conversation of, hey, where is our money actually made? Because I want to know, hey, what divisions of this company aren't really contributing that much to the bottom line, because those just became my test case. For the things that I'm really not sure about, let's take them down, because that's not going to ruin our end of quarter numbers. So the company I started off at was a retailer, so that was obvious. Don't take down the stores. Under no circumstances do you take down the stores.
Right.
But legal,
right.
Go for it.
Yeah.
I don't know how legal would feel about that,
Right.
But yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Basically, so every change that you made, you don't have to roll it out company wide.
Right.
You put it into places where you felt that it would hopefully the change would have a minimal impact. But if it did have an impact, it would have a minimal impact to the company, because it only made legal not be able to do something for a day or two.
Absolutely.
Which is a very different thing than no one can log into the cash registers for a day or two.
Absolutely. And retail, taking down the chain is the worst thing you could possibly do.
Yeah, exactly. So for the record, I actually started in retail. I worked 100 years ago. I was a shoe salesman at a chain called Kenny Shoes, which no one under 25 even know exists. But it was the parent company that created Foot Locker. So Foot Locker is still around, but Kenny Shoes was its own store, and I worked in retail. So I know, and I also worked at some what we now call big box stores. So I know what it's like to be at the receiving end of that. And when corporation changes things and then poof, you suddenly can't do your job. That's unacceptable.
So you went through this exercise, you had this process of going for 6 months, doing a security update or rollout a week. And then you started writing about this, small things that people can do to improve their security posture. And where did you go from there? Like, did you think you would keep writing this long? Because how long have you been posting on Reddit with your security cadence posts?
So I only started it in January. I did it as a New Year's resolution. And the idea came to me. I was on a different podcast. And we were talking about InfoSec, and we were talking about a term that I believe Wendy Nather from Duo Security coined, which is InfoSec poverty. And it's basically in reference to companies that just don't have the resources to have dedicated InfoSec people or InfoSec tooling, and how it's not really fair to expect these companies that just don't have those resources to really be able to stand up against the modern era of security threats. So on this podcast, we were discussing what can we as InfoSec professionals do to help those companies. And it's been kind of living rent free in the back of my brain since I was on that podcast. So as I was approaching the new year, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to hop on Reddit starting in January and make that weekly post and see if I can't help some of the folks in the sysadmin subreddit, which the sysadmin subreddit, they have the flares for everyone, and there's a lot of them that list themselves as jack of all trades, and those are those sysadmins that are working in smaller companies, and they're if it plugs into the wall, that's their job. And those companies are exactly what InfoSec poverty is calling out. Of you have these brilliant sysadmins who are heavily overburdened, and they just don't have the time to focus on this. And they just kind of need someone to say, hey, this week, why don't you disable this one thing that comes out of the box in Windows and you do not need, and it creates a massive security risk. So I started in January, and I have a nice long list in OneNote of posts to make, and every week around Wednesday night, I just pull one up and I write a quick blog post.
Yeah, because you can't schedule Reddit posts, right? I don't think.
Right. You can put them in draft. So I write them Wednesday night, and Monday morning I remove it from draft.
Got. Yeah, that was Paul's InfoSec Weekly, I believe. Was it the podcast
Correct.
where you were?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Shout out to them. So you said you started it in January. So you're what? Like 8 or 9 posts in on that. And did this what do you call it? Or maybe like 10. I don't know. I can't do math. Anyway, this the ransomware post, where did that fall into that?
So
the cadence.
Yeah, it's a fun question, because literally since I started this, since post 1, I've had people messaging me on Reddit saying, hey, could you do something about ransomware? Because it's a top of mind topic, especially for the smaller orgs. That's the big boogeyman. And I've been honestly kind of Mr. Miyagiing it in terms of, well, everything I'm posting really has to do with ransomware. You just don't realize it. But when
I'm not sure if everybody listening will understand that reference, but very nice reference. I like that.
Yeah, so my expectation was I have a list of posts that eventually I was going to say, hey, if you've been messaging me about ransomware, go read these posts. This is what I was driving at. But then when Russia invaded Ukraine and the Conti ransomware groups came out and said that anyone that takes up arms or goes against Russia, we're going to come after, I got flooded with people saying, no, really, please, we need something. So hence the title, the okay, fine, let's talk about ransomware.
Yeah.
So I decided, it was time to just at least take a truncated approach to it.
How did you approach, because ransomware is such a huge topic, right? I know, Curtis, you and we talked about it, but just sort of your thought process behind like the series that you wrote, and how do you get such a dense topic out there? Because there are so many different ways that ransomware can attack you, and so many different crews out there with different methods. So how do you sort of generalize it, especially like you said, for those people who don't have the time to research and follow up everything related to InfoSec, right?
Yeah. So, and I giggle when you say dense, because one of the other pieces of feedback I get quite frequently is that my posts are too long. But yeah, so my take on ransomware is that companies tend to focus on the exact wrong spot. And I apologize for coming onto a backup related podcast and say that most companies focus on backup, and that's your last effort. That's the thing that hopefully saves the company when everything else has just gone poorly for you.
Yeah. And don't worry, Snorkel, we have the same opinion as well, or at least I do, right? That it's just a last resort, but you should really be protecting yourself up front.
Right. And so the thing that happens every time there's a major ransomware breach, is, it hits the media and everyone starts talking about the indicators of compromise. IT loves to talk about indicators of compromise because it's easy to deal with. How did they get in? Oh, it was an email. Well, where did the email come from? What was the subject? Did it link to something? Where did the link go to? What did it download? What was the hash that it downloaded? And on and on and on and on. And because it's easy then to go into your controls and, we're going to put in our spam filters to block that address. We're going to block that domain. We're going to put in our endpoint for security tools to block that hash. But it's all pointless, right? Because that breach is done. That entire infrastructure has been burned. There's nothing left of it. So, you're reacting to something that no longer exists. But what no one ever asks is, wait a minute, how did, Susie in accounting downloading this attachment lead to their entire VMware infrastructure getting encrypted? And that's the real takeaway from every single ransomware breach. It's one thing to come in and, the accounting system, one person in the accounting system is encrypted. It's another thing entirely to come in and, the entire network is gone now and we don't have any data. And that's really where the security cadence posts come in. And what I try to focus on, especially in the first post, of this is what I would be doing right now. If you are waking up to a world where Russia has invaded Ukraine and you are all of a sudden greatly concerned that ransomware group's going to come after you, these are the things to start off with. And it isn't necessarily preventing ransomware, it's preventing ransomware from being able to do anything significant. And the nice thing about those controls is it translates to way more than just ransomware, which is another issue that I think smaller companies particularly have when they're dealing with InfoSec, is they put their blinders on very specific attack types. Like, how do we protect against ransomware? Oh, we get good backups. Well, how do we protect against any sort of extortion attempt? We had the Lupus group, or excuse me, Lapsus?
Yeah, I think it was totally
blanked their name.
Yep.
I've been talking about all week and I just blanked on their name. Anyways, going after NVIDIA and Okta and Microsoft and LG, really their playbook is the exact same as a ransomware group. Ransomware only exists not because they care about encrypting your data. They want to extort you for money. Ransomware shifted recently to exfiltrating data because people had good backups or had restoration methods. Well, fine, let's steal the data because we never really cared about encrypting the data. We just needed that incentive to get you to pay. So when you take a step back and look at how attacks function from the ground up and start going at the common denominators, you really don't care about what the actual end objective is any longer, because the controls are there to make sure that they never made it past sending that initial email, or attacking this particular vulnerability you had exposed to the perimeter for a week.
Because those vulnerabilities will constantly be evolving, right? And
exactly.
So you kind of need a generic protection scheme, if you will, rather than something tailored for a particular ransom group that comes after you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a ransomware attack it's the conclusion of, what, like, you got infected, but the ransom, I don't know if I'm not saying this right, but I want to say it's the symptom, but it is actually the infection, right? But that wasn't the problem. The problem is what allowed them to get there in the first place.
You're absolutely right. And it's interesting that it is a multi-tiered product at this point. There are groups out there that sell you the initial breach.
Right.
So and Conti is one of the groups that are suspected of doing this, that they don't do the initial breach. They buy the breach. They buy someone who already has the foothold and then use that foothold to do the actual encryption. And so you have this entire life cycle of, third-party vendors that lead up to the final breach, right? Conti may be purchasing someone else's exploit kits, someone else's encryption kits. So you're exactly right that there's the initial breach that's really your first opportunity. And when you get to the point where things are encrypting, so many other things have been missed by that point that, at least if you get to that point, you have a lot of great opportunities to prevent it from happening again. because you should have learned so much up to that point of, oh my gosh, they got the phishing email through. My end user was able to download this thing. They were able to click this link to this weird domain that was stood up yesterday. They were able to execute a program after they downloaded it off the internet. I mean, all these different controls that had to go poorly just to get to that point of encryption.
Now, speaking of phishing, I did see something like, it was just a couple of days ago, and they were, and again, I don't remember exactly where I saw it, but it was like, it was saying that phishing had surpassed, that it had now become the number one method of attacking companies versus, I guess, a standard exploit, I guess, would be number two, right? A standard sort of direct hacking attempt. That phishing had become the number one. I don't know if it sounds like you saw that as the number one.
Yeah, actually, one of the things I really like with the security cadence post is when people get in and correct me or point out other things, because I'm certainly not an expert in all things. But in the first ransomware post I made, a person who works for a cyber insurance policyholder actually called me out and said, phishing is the number one for sure, but right close on its heels is the proxy shell exchange vulnerability, which is a vulnerability from last year, and impacting on-prem exchange deployments, and still plenty of unpatched boxes out there. But yeah, you get these massive blips, right? A log4j sort of thing that is a crazy large vulnerability that attackers jump on quickly, but the eternal one is always phishing. It's always social engineering. It's the quickest path to get past your perimeter.
Yeah. And especially with some of these large spikes, you also have the long tails, right?
Right.
In terms of how long it takes to get every single system out there patched. And you'll always have systems out there which don't go patched for so long and still continues to be an attack vector, right?
Right. And it's that InfoSec debt again of, a company that hired someone else to come stand up their IT infrastructure one time and it's been neglected ever since. There's no one patching those systems. They're running their Exchange 2003 deployment still. I mean, they're out there.
Yeah. By the way, here's what I want to say. Who the hell is still running on-prem Exchange? That's all I want to say about that. And why aren't you using 365? That's all I'm saying. Microsoft, you're welcome. I'm just saying, there's just too big of a risk.
Wait, you forgot to add one thing to that, Curtis.
What's that?
If you are using Microsoft 365, make sure to back it up.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Because Microsoft isn't doing it for you. Yeah. It's a standard thing we have to mention here on the podcast.
So a dropper is typically the initial thing that gets downloaded. So if you look through a normal, any sort of malware campaign, we'll keep it with ransomware, that I send an email as an attacker that's a phishing email, and the whole point is to try to trick someone into clicking a link and downloading a program. Or maybe it's attached. Maybe it's a Word document or something like that that's attached, but it's something small. And typically you're going to see it as a document macro. And the whole point of it is that's the simple, easy thing that's going to slip through, your various defenses because it's just a Word document. But you enable the macro, and the macro is what reaches out and downloads the current malware. And there's a few reasons for that. A big one is that malware could potentially be being generated on the fly, meaning that the definition that's behind that, the hash for it, or the detection mechanisms that more traditional antivirus is looking at, won't have those definitions because it was generated at the moment of download. With just minor changes, but just to throw off that hash. But then that's the thing that actually gets downloaded and executed, and causes you all your problems. And from there, it could be any number of things. So as we were saying, that there are people who would just sell you that footprint, right, or that foothold.
Right.
So that dropper could download just your C2, just something that's calling back saying, "Yep, I got something running on this computer," and that's it.
Oh, it could literally. Oh, okay. So it could just literally sit there, wait for the second group that's going to purchase that, and then they download the malware that they want to download. Interesting.
Right. So
that's what you were referring to earlier. And so it looked like and again, this is common sense to you, but not necessarily to everybody. It looked like, your best advice was to stop ransomware is to just think about how ransomware works when it gets in, when that dropper gets in. You're not going to, I mean, yes, you should do user training, and yes, you should do all those things.
Sure.
But you should just assume that at least one of them is going to get it wrong. I mean, I remember back when I was, 25 some years ago, when I was at a bank, we did regular InfoSec training with every new, employee. And one of the things we constantly said was, no one in IT will ever call and ask you for your password, ever, ever, ever. And then immediately after the training, we would call them and ask them for their password. And still a percentage of them would give it to us. Right. So you do the training, but then you just sort of assume that that's going to, you know, that somebody's going to click on the wrong link. And so then you just think about stopping that malware at that point, stopping them from accessing a command and control server, looking for, this weird, domains that stood up yesterday, domains that were stood up a long time ago that just suddenly went active, the limiting lateral movement inside the company, all of these things. What did I miss?
A big thing that a lot of ransomware particularly will do first thing is start deleting shadow copies as a quick restoration point. So that is a pretty dead giveaway. If you get the event ID that a shadow copy was just deleted, that's probably
and
something
you're
you want
referring
to
to
act
VSS there, right? The Windows
Exactly.
volume shadow copy. Yeah.
So I had
Okay.
a question for you, Snorkel, about that one. Does that prevent backup apps from actually running that might leverage VSS and shadow copies?
Maybe is the short answer, but depending on how you attack this, if your attack for this is just I want an alert on anything that deletes shadow copies. Well, if you have a backup solution that makes use of shadow copies and deletes shadow copies, then that's something that you tune out, right? So you need to know the source of what deleted that, and that should be your event ID, and you just tune that one out.
Gotcha. So then you should
Gotcha.
only look for anomalous events that
Exactly.
happen.
Typically, backup apps are going to create a shadow copy just to have a stable frame of reference, and then delete it when they're done.
Your backup app is probably running as a service, so that's going to run a system or as your whatever your backup username is or user account is. Whereas your ransomware is likely going to be running as that end user. So when you ask yourself, does an accountant have reason to be deleting shadow copies? Probably not.
Yeah. Gotcha. So you can look for all these patterns and determine what's real versus what's not. Because I guess that's the other hard part in InfoSec is like tuning out the noise or the normal behavior versus what's anomalous.
Right. And it all starts with really, really good logs. You need to have that logging information to know what's going on in your systems. But honestly, going back to the deleting of shadow copies, one of the other call-ups I made from a higher level is just looking at what would expect an end user to run, especially from the command prompt, right? Do you expect someone in legal to ever open a command prompt, let alone run who am I or run net, and start looking around your network? Probably not. So if someone in legal opens up a command prompt, that right there might be enough for you to go, well, that's weird. Start running, typical attack commands or, living off the land commands. Now it's real weird.
And what would you use to watch for? There was a tool, I forgot its name, that you mentioned about that.
So the tool I mentioned in one of my blog posts was Vaccine, which is vaccine with an R, which is a tool that just monitors for shadow copy deletion and just kills any process that does it. The problem is it doesn't discriminate. So again, if you do have a backup tool that does make use of deleting shadow copies, it's going to kill that process for you. But if you don't have that limitation, it's a really handy little quick, simple solution.
But can you tune that? Or do you need another tool that's tunable?
Well, it's open source, so you can certainly modify the code. But no, the current version that exists does not have any sort of options for that. It is a one and done sort of thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So that would be a perfect example of, like you said when we were talking earlier. Let's try this, right? And then hopefully it doesn't kill the backups. But if it does kill the backups, it would be pretty obvious because all the backups will fail because they're unable to create the shadow copies.
I think one of the ones, and I don't know which article number it was from, that I thought was very unique that you brought up was A different way to sort of trick the ransomware into sort of not destroying your entire infrastructure. I think one of the examples you brought up is sort of creating hidden drives and bookending normal drives available on that system, so ransomware kind of gets stuck, or you can monitor
Right.
for that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's part two, in case you're wondering. So the actions on objectives post. So we have the initial infection. They mapped your network. They're starting to spread out. Now they're actually going to start trying to attack. At this point, one you have to call out that in 2022, one hopes that your endpoint security software, whatever antivirus and malware you're running, sees process X is encrypting Word document Y. I'm going to kill it. If it doesn't, you really need to have a come to Jesus moment with your endpoint protection vendor at this point. But if you have something that's running that's actively doing that, at that point, I think one of the best controls you can possibly have is feeding it data that you don't care about and putting alerts on it. So, as you were saying, Prasanna, one of the things I do is I create deceptive file shares on my network. So just file servers that, on their own separate Windows box don't have any useful data on them. I actually just clone my actual production file names and structures and just put random data in them. But then I make drive mappings on my endpoints, hidden drive mappings that from the Windows GUI you can't see them, but from the command prompt you can. And I just bookend my valid drives. So you have a home drive at H, so put something before that and put something after that, and hopefully the ransomware will go after those first. And then I put just files on those servers that I monitor. If anything gets changed for them, no reason for anyone to ever touch these servers. No reason for anyone to ever touch these files.
Right.
So if anything gets modified, then it sets off alerts, and I know something weird is going on. And hopefully it buys you enough time to to remote in at 3 a.m. and shut down whatever's going on. And yeah, the other thing I offered up in that was what I coined as a ransomware tar pit of an actual service that's just running or monitoring that server. And if it starts seeing files getting modified, it starts generating more. So, hey, the ransomware hit my fake file share. It encrypted file one. Well, here's 4 more files for you. And it'll just keep going and just keep going. And, it may not be foolproof, but it might
Right.
just, depending on how the ransomware is written, it might just put in a loop that it will never escape from.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of honeypots is not new, but I like this
Sure.
sort of modifying it to, the world of ransomware. I agree with everything you said about stopping it in the first place. What about detecting data exfiltration? What do you think companies can do there?
Yeah, so it's definitely a trickier process, mainly from a tooling standpoint. At this point, you're probably going to have to open up the wallet. But there's just the basic security controls of content filtering and making sure that your end users don't have a path out to the internet for mass file transfers. So for most enterprises, you probably don't need more than HTTP and HTTPS from your workstations. So a lot of those transfers are trying to transfer out via FTP or a more traditional file transfer method that shouldn't be allowed. But going further, you need to look at what sites are out there for allowing mass transfers. To keep it simple, do all of your users need to be able to reach Dropbox, or Box or Google Drive or any of that stuff? If the answer is no, prevent it, because that's an exfiltration method.
Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
I guess I had this apparently misconception that they would be sending these exfiltrated files to something that they owned and controlled.
Right. So I'm trying to build this out from what's easier to harder to implement.
Okay.
Going to that point, yes. So when you get to the point of we're going to just transfer to something we own, and honestly, at that point, you're probably hitting up AWS or Azure or something like that, and that's where it gets really messy. Unfortunately, in the cloud world we live in, you can't exactly block Azure, right? But that's where I start looking at DNS security. And one of my absolute favorite controls is just blocking newly registered domains or domains that have been parked for years that have all of a sudden gone live. Because a lot of the attack infrastructure, and this is honestly a great way of also stopping the initial drop or download, because there's a good chance that that's going to go somewhere that was just newly stood up. But yeah, so that is another control where you might be able to just stop them from being able to get to whatever destination they've stood up to accept these files. Another point is always just a basic security control of proper ACLs. When it gets to data exfiltration, again, keep picking on poor Susie in accounting, but poor Susie in accounting shouldn't be able to get to your HR documents. She shouldn't be able to get to your operations documents. Yeah, they might be able to export out your payroll, which that's terrible. But your payroll showing up on Payspin tomorrow is a bad day. It's not an end of the company sort of day, though, right? Like that's not trade secrets going out. So that's another control. Another thing that I would absolutely call out, though, is still honey documents. Having documents for them to interact and transfer out, that as soon as you see someone interact with that, you're figuring out what process it was and figuring out where system that came from and stopping that information. And then going into probably the more logical solution, but definitely at a cost, it's just the behavioral controls. Because in that exfiltration attempt, there's going to be an endpoint that's all of a sudden transferring a lot of data out to a new source that has never been seen before. And if you really know what normal looks like in your network, that should stick out like a big, big red flag. And it's a very hard thing to do with free solutions, but there are plenty of security products out there that are all about mapping how your endpoints interact with each other on the network and what looks like normal, what isn't normal. I think it's money well spent for those types of controls.
Can I ask a question about an earlier topic you brought up around EDR?
Mm-hmm.
So if EDRs are useful for detecting when encryption is happening and killing processes, etc., if that's the case, would a lot of these ransomware attacks be prevented to start with? And is it that companies who've been hit with ransomware have not deployed EDR solutions in their environments? If EDRs can detect when encryption is happening on endpoint devices, if a company has deployed EDRs, does that mean they'd be able to stop ransomware? And so a lot of companies who got hit with ransomware didn't have EDRs deployed.
Endpoint detection response is what we're talking about here. So, first, information security is all about layered defenses, and you never rely on a single defense. In my mind, when your antivirus, your EDR, whatever your endpoint security tool is, if that's the thing that stops the malware, thank God it was there. But that's still oh my goodness, how many different things failed before I got to the point where that had to step up? Like I never want to see anything out of that system. That's not false positives, because that's the fun with EDRs. They are a pile of false positives. To your question of did they not have it? Maybe. EDRs are expensive. They are expensive tools. They're great tools, but they are expensive. And like so many other expensive security tools, they're rarely set it and forget it tools. They are tools that require a lot of tuning and a lot of defining of what's right, within your enterprise. But you certainly have a lot of companies out there that are still, with old definition-based antivirus that's just scanning files and doing your nightly full scans, like we did back in the 90s. And companies that have been very happy to embrace Microsoft Defender as their only antivirus. And, there's some logic to it. It's a great solution, and it's free depending on what your Office 365 licensing looks like. But I think the number of customers out there that have these large EDR solutions are few and far between. Definitely the companies I'm targeting with my security cadence posts are the companies that probably don't have that kind of investment.
Yeah. Or even if they did, sort of managing it on a daily basis becomes difficult,
right.
Especially with everything else they have to do, because it's not a one and done sort of a deal.
Right. And, honestly, if you think about it as the evolution of antivirus was a one and done for the most part. You deployed Symantec back in the day, the next finish, and you never touched it again. Right.
Yeah.
EDRs aren't that. EDRs are constant tuning and definitions and breaking things in your environment and having to tune them back out. And I think that's also another call that I know of a number of companies that have thrown their EDRs out because, it just broke everything. That product was terrible. It wasn't. You just needed the resources to handle it properly.
Yeah. I want to sort of round out things here. There's some things that we haven't talked about that were obvious ones that were mentioned in your first post. That you talked about your password security. You talked about MFA. These are things that just everybody should be doing. My personal opinion at this point, if you're not doing MFA on anything that matters, you're not doing your job, and that's my opinion for what it's worth. But MFA stops so many things.
Yeah, you're waiting for me to disagree. I wasn't going to.
But I have a question for you, though. So I don't know if we're going to talk about it now or later, but I've read recently with a lot of the Lapsus attacks as well as other gangs, right? There is a notion of SIM swapping attacks, right? Which sort of hurt some of the MFA approaches taken.
So Prasanna, don't let perfect get in the way of being good.
I was gonna say that. That goes right to that, right? Yeah. Just because it won't fix everything doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, right?
But no, your point is
there is no silver bullet, right? And a good backup person would never say don't do InfoSec, and a good InfoSec person would never say do backup or not do backup. But I think that MFA is just so. And by the way, I finally ate my own dog food maybe about 2 years ago, where I just realized that there were a lot of vendors that I personally interacted with, banks and things, that offered MFA as an option. And I finally said, look, I know it's going to make it harder for me to access my bank account and my PayPal. And, there's only there's only like 20 accounts that I felt had that level of information that I needed MFA on. And then I became like this MFA Nazi, where I was like, I'm mad at them if they don't offer MFA.
I remember what happened when you traded in your phone and you lost access to your MFA.
So I was using a Google Authenticator, not realizing that when I traded in my phone that I lost all of my MFA tokens. And so I switched actually to Authy so that I don't have that problem. But and now I'm actually looking at a password manager. I think it's 1Password that manages both your passwords and your MFA stuff. That sounds nice. I'm already a big password manager fan. I just didn't, I currently have to use 2 solutions, but yeah.
Yeah, and to your point, Prasanna, about SIM jacking and it not being a silver bullet, the one thing I'd say is not all MFAs are created equal. Any MFA is better than no MFA. But it doesn't have to be a roadblock in your organization. FIDO keys, Titan keys, things like that are literally, you get the prompt and you tap a thing hanging out of your USB port, or tap something to your phone, is a really, really nice MFA solution that's really easy for your users and requires something that you have that's truly physical, and rather than replying to a text message. And there's one of the big debates going on in the InfoSec world right now is the push notifications of yes, that was me, and it's right out of the playbook of Lapsus of just they actually had a picture on Twitter yesterday of one of their chats saying just spam them 100 times. Eventually they'll get mad and hit yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I actually had our MFA at work today went a little bit sideways, and it started pinging me repeatedly for something I had just tried to sign into. And I had it in the back of my mind, like, like I had to go check the logs to make sure, like, this is kind of weird. But still, it's better than nothing. And yeah, your end user may fail you and hit yes, that was me, because I got tired of getting this prompt 100 times at 3 a.m. But still. But as InfoSec practitioners, that's where we need to step in and go, don't we think it was abnormal that they got 100 prompts? Like, did that not set off an alarm right there? Why is this user getting pinged over and over and over and over again? Because I guarantee you that created a log somewhere.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the summary statement of your blog series or your post series, whatever we want to call this. And by the way, your posts are long. After you making the comment, I went, and while you were talking, I copy and pasted the 3 posts into a Google Docs. One of them is 4,500 words long, my friend. I mean, that's long even for me. I'm just saying.
I got to tell you, someone the other day commented about how much they liked my writing style, and it was the first time ever in my 42 years of life that anyone has ever said such a thing.
I actually liked your writing style. I thought it was good.
This is the reason you're here is you write. Well, it's a complicated issue. So, I jab, but 4,500 words is not that much for an issue of this magnitude, right? But the first was 2,500, the second one was 2,000, but the last one was 4,500. I was like, yeah, the boy could talk.
I would just reiterate what I said of so many companies focus on the recovery side. And that focus comes from focusing on what the actual objective was of the ransomware group to begin with. What was it they were trying to do? Well, they were going to encrypt your stuff. So you start there, and it's the wrong place to start. Start at the beginning. Start with how they were going to compromise your first endpoint. And if you start looking at InfoSec from that perspective, what you'll end up finding, and it's a really gratifying feeling, is you'll turn on the news one day and there will be the latest massive vulnerability or exploit being discussed. And you'll look at it and go, oh, my controls account for that. Not because I built controls around that particular exploit or vulnerability, but because I just built my controls around how do I walk an attacker through initial foothold, moving laterally throughout my environment, and then acting on their objectives. And then how do I stop them at each one of those steps? So I guess the too long didn't read it, to use Reddit terminology. Don't focus on ransomware, just focus on how attacks function, and you'll get ransomware taken care of by default.
Right. And the only major one that we didn't discuss, which we really should have, is the whole patching thing. Right. I go back to, I'm pretty sure if my memory serves correctly, WannaCry was, it was one of the first big ones that really went, it went haywire and everywhere. If I recall correctly, it was an exploit that had been patched a year prior in Windows. And if you had just been anywhere near up to date, then you'd have been fine.
Yeah, and Microsoft they're both great in how they maintain with a lion's grip or with an iron grip to backwards compatibility, and they are also just ridiculous in their lion's grip. I don't know why I keep saying lion's grip. Iron grip on backwards compatibility. But I mean, WannaCry, the other side of WannaCry is exposure to the internet. Which, and this kind of goes back to the proxy shell thing. WannaCry went gangbusters because of all the companies that had Samba, SMB, exposed to the internet. Which, again, is you take a step back and go, good God, why? But then you go jump on something like Shodan and you look like, oh yeah, there's tons. There's tons of vCenters exposed to the internet, and you go, good God, why? And again, it just kind of comes down to, well, I had this one sysadmin who was overworked and doing what they could, and we had this use case, and he stood it up, but he wasn't InfoSec focused. He didn't know what he was doing, and in that regards, and didn't see the problem with it. So yeah, I mean, to your point of patching, absolutely. But I guess my takeaway is focus on patching the big things and don't worry about the latest 0 day quite as much. Because I tell you, attackers rarely are focused on that because there's so much low hanging fruit of the stuff that has been patched since 2018 anyways.
Yeah, you mentioned SMB. My other big one is RDP, right?
Yeah.
RDP to the internet is just, I just want to slap you. Well, listen, we could talk all day. I want to say thank you again, and for coming on the podcast and talking these really important things.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. I have to say, when I got your message, like, wait, is that Mr. Backup? That is Mr. Backup. I was really excited.
This is me. And I'm honored that you knew who I was. So hey, we're members of the Mutual Admiration Society, right, Prasanna?
Yeah, no, it's been great, Snorkel, having you on, and yeah, great articles. I will continue to read. I hope you keep doing your weekly posts on Security Cadence, because I'm sure a lot of people learn a lot of things from that. So
I'll try to make a Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, keep it long.
Yeah.
I like them.
Yeah, good. Good luck with that. Yeah, he's easy to find on Reddit. He is Snorkel42. Make sure to check him out and make sure to subscribe.
The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.